Welcome to the world of daily life stories. Don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss new stories. Enjoy listening. The Unexpected Encounter. Anthony King adjusted the strap of his carry-on bag as he moved along with the slow tide of passengers boarding Flight 528 to San Francisco. The terminal buzzed with a predictable rhythm, a symphony of announcements, rolling luggage, and muffled conversations. Anthony liked predictability. It was a quality that had carried him through his career as a self-made entrepreneur. Even now, as one of the wealthiest individuals in the country, he clung to the routines that had once defined his humble beginnings. He stepped forward as the line moved, handing his boarding pass to the gate agent, a young man who barely glanced up before scanning it. "Enjoy your flight," the agent said mechanically, already turning to the next passenger. Anthony offered a polite nod and made his way down the jet bridge. Inside the cabin, the familiar scent of recycled air and disinfectant greeted him. He navigated to his seat, 2A, in first class. It was a corner of the plane designed for comfort and exclusivity, a space he had earned but seldom flaunted. As he stowed his bag in the overhead bin and settled into the wide leather seat, Anthony couldn't help but glance around. The other passengers in first class were already absorbed in their own worlds, reading, sipping pre-flight champagne, or scrolling through their devices. Anthony reached for the in-flight magazine, flipping it open as he prepared for the flight. He was engrossed in an article when a sharp voice broke through his thoughts. "Excuse me, sir, are you sure you're in the right seat?" He looked up, surprised. Standing before him was a tall woman in her early 40s, her blonde hair pulled into a sleek bun. Her uniform, with its perfectly pressed lines and polished insignia, identified her as a senior flight attendant. The name tag on her chest read Heather Collins. Her expression was one of polite suspicion. "Yes, this is my seat," Anthony replied, his voice calm and measured. Heather's eyes narrowed slightly as she leaned in. "This section is reserved for first class," she said, her tone firm but not unkind. "If you could show me your boarding pass, I'll help you find your assigned seat." Anthony felt a knot tighten in his stomach, but he didn't let it show. He reached into his jacket pocket and retrieved his boarding pass, handing it to her. "Here you go." Heather examined the pass, her expression flickering with surprise for the briefest of moments before she quickly masked it. "I see," she said, handing the pass back. "Apologies for the confusion." But her tone lacked warmth, and Anthony noticed the way her gaze lingered on him, as if trying to reconcile his presence in first class with her preconceived notions. He nodded politely, tucking the boarding pass back into his pocket. Heather walked away, but the interaction left an unpleasant aftertaste. Anthony leaned back in his seat, trying to shake off the discomfort. He was no stranger to being underestimated or treated with skepticism. It was an experience he had encountered far too often, even as a billionaire. The plane began to fill with passengers, and the pre-flight announcements echoed through the cabin. Heather returned a few moments later, distributing drinks and hot towels. When she reached Anthony, her demeanor was professional but distant. "Would you like a pre-flight beverage, mister?" She trailed off, clearly unsure how to address him. "King," Anthony supplied. "Just water, please." Heather handed him a glass of water without meeting his eyes. Anthony accepted it with a small smile, determined not to let the moment define his flight. As the plane taxied and eventually lifted off, Anthony tried to lose himself in his magazine, but the earlier interaction replayed in his mind. He thought of all the times he had walked into boardrooms, luxury stores, or high-end restaurants only to be met with similar reactions. It wasn't about the money, he knew his worth and didn't need validation. But moments like these reminded him that even success couldn't always shield him from prejudice. Halfway through the flight, Anthony decided to stretch his legs. He made his way to the galley at the front of the plane, where Heather was organizing drink orders. She barely glanced up as he approached. "Excuse me," Anthony said, his tone polite but firm. "Do you have a moment?" Heather looked up, her expression guarded. "Yes, how can I assist you?" "I wanted to clear the air," Anthony began. "I couldn't help but notice your reaction when you first saw me in my seat. I've been flying for years, and I've never had to explain myself like that. Heather stiffened. I was just doing my job, sir. Ensuring everyone is seated correctly is part of my responsibilities. I understand that, Anthony replied. But let's not pretend it was just about the seat. I've seen that look before, many times. It's not pleasant, and it's not something I should have to deal with, especially here. Heather opened her mouth to respond, but before she could, another flight attendant approached. She was younger, with a warm smile and an easy demeanor. Is everything okay here? The young woman asked, glancing between Anthony and Heather. Yes, Anthony said, stepping back. Just a conversation. He returned to his seat, but the tension lingered. He noticed Heather avoiding his gaze for the remainder of the flight, her interactions with him curt and minimal. Anthony decided to let it go, focusing instead on his work. He pulled out his laptop and began reviewing the financial reports he had downloaded before boarding. But the universe had other plans. As the flight approached its halfway point, a commotion erupted in the galley. Passengers turned their heads, and Anthony noticed the young flight attendant from earlier rushing toward the cockpit. Moments later, an announcement crackled over the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, we apologize for the inconvenience, but there has been a change in staffing. Please remain seated as we address the situation. Anthony raised an eyebrow, curiosity piqued. He watched as another flight attendant took over Heather's duties, her expression calm but focused. The remainder of the flight proceeded without incident, but Anthony couldn't shake the feeling that something significant had just transpired. As the plane touched down in San Francisco and taxied to the gate, Anthony gathered his belongings, preparing to disembark. As he stepped off the plane, he was greeted by an airline representative waiting at the gate. Mr. King, the representative said, extending a hand. We'd like to apologize for the experience you had on board today. If you have a moment, we'd like to discuss it further. Anthony paused, his curiosity turning to intrigue. I'm listening, he said. The story was far from over. Unbeknownst to him, this flight would mark the beginning of an extraordinary chain of events, ones that would challenge assumptions, redefine respect, and shine a light on the power of standing up for oneself. Anthony followed the airline representative down the jet bridge, his curiosity mounting. He wasn't entirely sure what to expect, but the firm yet apologetic tone of the representative had caught his attention. The woman led him to a private lounge, tucked away from the bustling terminal. Inside, two other representatives were seated, their expressions a mix of professionalism and unease. Mr. King, thank you for taking the time to meet with us, one of them began, gesturing for him to sit. My name is Alan, and I'm the regional manager for this airline. We've been informed about an incident on your flight, and we'd like to address it directly. Anthony leaned back in his chair, studying Alan. He appreciated the directness, but wasn't entirely sure how much he wanted to engage. Incident is a strong word, Anthony said, his tone even. It was a moment of discomfort, nothing more. I'm used to it. The other representative, a woman named Carla, leaned forward, her expression sincere. That's exactly what we'd like to address, Mr. King. Moments like these should never be something anyone gets used to. We've already taken steps to investigate what occurred. Anthony raised an eyebrow. Investigate? I'm not sure there's anything to investigate. It was a subtle interaction, and while unpleasant, it's hardly the first time I've encountered something like it. Carla nodded, her hands folded neatly on the table. We understand, and we deeply regret that you've had to experience such treatment. However, the situation escalated after your conversation with Ms. Collins. She made comments in the galley that were overheard by other crew members, comments that we cannot ignore. Anthony felt his interest sharpen. Comments? Alan hesitated, as if choosing his words carefully. Ms. Collins expressed frustration about your presence in first class. She suggested, wrongly and inappropriately, that perhaps there had been a mistake with your ticket. Her tone and language were unprofessional and unacceptable. A junior flight attendant reported the incident to the pilot, which led to her being replaced mid-flight. Anthony's jaw tightened. While he wasn't entirely surprised, hearing the details made the knot in his stomach resurface. Replaced mid-flight? That's a serious step. It is, Carla said. But we have a zero-tolerance policy for discriminatory behavior, especially when it compromises the comfort and dignity of our passengers. Ms. Collins' actions did not align with our company's values. Anthony considered their words. On one hand, he appreciated the swift action. On the other, he couldn't help but wonder if it was a reaction to his status as a high-profile passenger rather than a genuine commitment to change. I appreciate your transparency, he said finally. But what happens next? Removing her mid-flight is one thing, but what about the larger issue? This kind of bias isn't unique to her. Alan nodded, acknowledging the point. You're absolutely right. Addressing systemic issues requires more than addressing individual incidents. That's why we're reviewing our training programs and policies. Additionally, we'd like to invite you to participate in a discussion about improving inclusivity within our airline. Anthony tilted his head, intrigued. You want my input? More than that, Carla interjected. We want your leadership. You've built a reputation for advocating for diversity and breaking barriers. We believe your insights could be invaluable. Anthony paused, considering their offer. While he was no stranger to such opportunities, he didn't want to become a token figure in a corporate attempt to save face. I'll think about it, he said, standing. But let's not pretend this is about me. It's about ensuring no one has to feel out of place, no matter who they are or where they're seated. The representatives nodded, thanking him for his time. As Anthony walked out of the lounge and into the terminal, he couldn't shake the weight of the interaction. He had always been proud of the life he had built, but moments like these reminded him that his journey was far from complete. Success had not insulated him from prejudice, and perhaps it never would. The ride to his hotel was uneventful, giving him time to reflect. San Francisco was a city he knew well, both for its opportunities and its challenges. As he gazed out the window, watching the skyline come into view, Anthony made a decision. He would use this incident not as a moment of frustration but as a catalyst for change. The next morning, Anthony's assistant, Rachel, called him. She was efficient, intuitive, and always a step ahead. Good morning, Mr. King, she said cheerfully. I saw the email from the airline. They're eager to follow up. What would you like me to do? Schedule a meeting, Anthony said. I want to hear more about their plans. Rachel hesitated. Are you sure? You have a packed schedule this week. I'm sure, he replied. This is important. 2 days later, Anthony found himself in a sleek conference room at the airline's headquarters. Alan and Carla were there, along with several other executives. The atmosphere was serious but hopeful, as if they were on the brink of something significant. Thank you for joining us, Mr. King, Carla began. We've taken the liberty of drafting some initial proposals for your review. Anthony held up a hand. Before we get into that, let's be clear about one thing. I'm not here to fix your problems for you. I'm here to offer perspective. The real work has to come from within. The room fell silent for a moment, and then Alan nodded. Understood. Let's start with what we've identified as areas for improvement. The discussion that followed was thorough and candid. Anthony didn't hold back, pointing out flaws in their approach and offering concrete suggestions. He emphasized the importance of not just addressing overt discrimination, but also the subtler biases that often went unnoticed. Training is important, he said, but it's not enough. You need accountability. Create systems that reward inclusivity and call out bias when it occurs. And don't just focus on your frontline staff. This has to start at the top. By the end of the meeting, Anthony felt cautiously optimistic. The executives seemed genuinely committed to change, and he appreciated their willingness to listen. Still, he knew the road ahead would be long. As he left the building, his phone buzzed with a text from Rachel. You have a call scheduled with the CEO of Horizon Ventures in an hour. Do you want me to push it back? Anthony smiled. Horizon Ventures was one of his newest investments, and the call was one he was looking forward to. No need, he replied. I'll be ready. Later that evening, as he sat in his hotel room reflecting on the day, Anthony realized something profound. The incident on the flight wasn't just a reminder of the challenges he faced, it was a call to action. He had spent his life breaking barriers and proving doubters wrong. Now, he had the opportunity to help others do the same. The next day, Anthony emailed Carla. I'm in, he wrote. Let's work together to make a real difference. And with that, the seeds of change were planted. For Anthony, the journey was far from over, but he was ready for whatever came next. Anthony King's commitment to collaborate with the airline marked a significant turning point, but he understood that words without actions meant little. His first step after agreeing to join their efforts was to outline a structured plan for their initiative. He spent the next week reviewing research on workplace inclusivity, case studies from other industries, and input from experts he trusted. His approach was deliberate. He wasn't interested in symbolic gestures or shallow campaigns. If he was going to lend his name and expertise, the results needed to be measurable and transformative. The airline, for its part, seemed eager to dive in. Carla reached out with a proposal for an inaugural session, an internal summit that would bring together senior leadership, frontline staff, and external consultants. Anthony agreed to attend, provided that the agenda went beyond surface-level discussions. He insisted on including real stories from employees and customers, believing that personal experiences were more impactful than corporate jargon. On the morning of the summit, Anthony arrived at the airline's training center, a sprawling campus outfitted with conference rooms, flight simulators, and mock cabins. The energy in the air was palpable, a mix of nervous anticipation and cautious optimism. Carla greeted him at the entrance, her clipboard in hand and a determined expression on her face. Mr. King, she said warmly, thank you again for being here. Your presence means a lot to everyone. Let's make sure it counts, Anthony replied, shaking her hand firmly. What's the lineup for today? Carla walked him through the schedule as they headed to the main conference room. The day would begin with a keynote address from the airline's CEO, followed by breakout sessions focused on specific areas like recruitment, customer service, and leadership accountability. Anthony was slated to speak during the afternoon panel on creating inclusive corporate cultures. The room was already filling with attendees when they entered. Executives in tailored suits mingled with flight attendants in crisp uniforms and ground crew members in safety vests. It was a rare gathering of every level of the organization, and Anthony could see the potential for meaningful dialogue. The CEO began the summit with a speech that was polished but earnest. He acknowledged the challenges the airline faced, particularly in light of recent events, and expressed a commitment to fostering a culture of respect and equality. While Anthony appreciated the sentiment, he couldn't help but notice the occasional flicker of skepticism on the faces of some attendees. It was clear that winning over the hearts and minds of the workforce would take more than words. When it was Anthony's turn to speak, he approached the podium with his usual calm confidence. He started by sharing his own story, how he had grown up in a working-class neighborhood, built a business from the ground up, and faced countless instances of bias along the way. He spoke candidly about the challenges of being underestimated and the resilience it took to succeed. I'm not here to lecture you, he said, his gaze sweeping the room. I'm here because I know what it feels like to be treated as if you don't belong. And I know that many of you, whether as employees or passengers, have felt the same. This isn't just about one incident or one person, it's about creating a system where everyone feels seen, heard, and valued. His words were met with a round of applause, but Anthony wasn't interested in applause. He wanted action. He ended his speech with a challenge to the attendees, to be honest about their own biases, to hold themselves and each other accountable, and to take ownership of the culture they wanted to create. The breakout sessions that followed were illuminating. Anthony opted to join the session focused on frontline interactions, where he listened intently as flight attendants and gate agents shared their experiences. Some spoke about dealing with difficult passengers, while others recounted moments when they had felt unsupported by management. A young flight attendant named Maria shared a particularly moving story about being reprimanded for standing up to a passenger who had made a racist remark toward her. "I was told I should have de-escalated the situation," Maria said, her voice tinged with frustration. "But how do you de-escalate someone questioning your humanity?" Her words hung in the air, and Anthony could see the ripple of discomfort they caused. It was a necessary discomfort, he thought. Change required facing uncomfortable truths. At the end of the session, Anthony addressed the group. "Maria, your story is exactly why we're here. Situations like that shouldn't just fall on your shoulders. It's up to the organization to empower you, to back you up, and to make it clear that behavior like that is unacceptable, not just for you, but for every employee and every passenger." By the end of the day, Anthony was both encouraged and sobered. The willingness to engage was there, but the road ahead was daunting. He met with Carla and the other organizers to debrief, emphasizing the need for sustained efforts rather than one-off events. "This can't just be a feel-good moment," he told them. "You need to follow through. Create a task force, track progress, and be transparent about what's working and what's not." Carla nodded, taking notes furiously. "We've already started drafting a framework for that. Would you be willing to review it?" "Of course," Anthony said. "But remember, the real test isn't the framework, it's how you implement it." The following months were a whirlwind of activity. The airline launched a comprehensive inclusivity initiative, complete with new training programs, updated policies, and a platform for employees to report concerns without fear of retaliation. Anthony served as an advisor, attending quarterly meetings and providing feedback on their progress. One of the most impactful changes was the introduction of an employee resource group dedicated to promoting diversity and inclusion. The group, aptly named Wings for All, quickly became a hub for dialogue and advocacy. Maria, the young flight attendant from the summit, became one of its co-chairs, using her voice to champion the changes she wanted to see. Anthony was heartened by the stories that began to emerge. Employees shared how the training sessions had opened their eyes to unconscious biases. Passengers wrote letters praising the newfound warmth and respect they felt during their travels. Even skeptics within the organization began to acknowledge the shift in culture. But progress was not without its challenges. There were setbacks, instances where old habits reared their heads, where change felt slow and inadequate. Anthony reminded Carla and her team that transformation was never linear. What mattered was their commitment to keep pushing forward. One afternoon, months after the summit, Anthony received a letter from a flight attendant he had never met. The letter described a recent incident where a passenger had berated a gate agent for enforcing baggage rules. Instead of brushing it off, the flight crew had rallied around the gate agent, making it clear that abusive behavior would not be tolerated. The writer credited the airline's new policies and training for giving them the confidence to stand up for their colleague. Anthony read the letter twice, a rare smile spreading across his face. It was a small victory, but a meaningful one. That evening, as he sat in his study reflecting on the journey so far, Anthony felt a sense of fulfillment he hadn't expected. The experience had reminded him of why he had built his career in the first place, not just to achieve personal success, but to create opportunities for others to thrive. He knew the work was far from over, but for the first time in a long time, he felt hopeful. The knot in his stomach that had tightened so often over the years began to loosen. He wasn't just a passenger on this flight of change, he was helping to pilot it. As he turned off his desk lamp and prepared to call it a night, his phone buzzed with a message from Carla. "Thanks for everything, Anthony. We couldn't have done this without you." He replied simply, "We're just getting started." Months passed, and the airline's inclusivity initiative continued to take shape. Anthony King remained involved, not as a passive figurehead but as an active advisor. He regularly reviewed progress reports, participated in strategy sessions, and even joined quarterly town hall meetings to hear directly from employees and passengers. Each interaction reaffirmed his belief that systemic change required persistence and collective effort. One evening, as Anthony was reviewing a stack of reports in his office, Rachel called. "Anthony, you need to see this," she said, her voice tinged with urgency. She forwarded a link to a viral video that had emerged overnight. Anthony opened the link. The video was shaky, clearly recorded on a passenger's phone, but its content was powerful. It showed a flight attendant standing firm as a passenger berated her over a seating issue. The passenger's tone was condescending, his words laced with entitlement, but the flight attendant never wavered. Calmly but firmly, she reiterated the airline's policies and emphasized the importance of respecting all passengers and crew members. When the passenger threatened to file a complaint, she simply replied, "You're welcome to do so, but our policies are in place to ensure everyone is treated fairly." The video ended with applause from other passengers, and the caption read, "When professionalism meets dignity." Kudos to this flight attendant for standing her ground. Anthony recognized the flight attendant immediately. It was Maria, the young woman who had shared her story during the summit. The video had already amassed millions of views, with countless comments praising her composure and the airline's evident shift in culture. The video struck a chord with Anthony. It wasn't just a moment of triumph for Maria, it was a tangible reflection of the progress they had worked so hard to achieve. He reached out to Carla immediately, congratulating her on the positive publicity and urging her to use the momentum to reinforce their message internally and externally. The airline acted swiftly, releasing a statement that celebrated Maria's professionalism and reaffirmed their commitment to creating an environment of respect and fairness. They also announced plans to expand their inclusivity training to include real-life scenarios like the one Maria had handled so gracefully. But not everyone was thrilled with the changes. Behind the scenes, pockets of resistance within the airline began to surface. Some employees complained that the new policies were overly restrictive, arguing that the focus on inclusivity came at the expense of efficiency. Others resented the additional training sessions, viewing them as unnecessary or performative. Anthony knew resistance was inevitable. Change, especially on a large scale, often felt uncomfortable. He requested a meeting with Carla and her team to address the pushback directly. When they convened, he emphasized the importance of communication and transparency. "People resist what they don't understand," Anthony said. "You need to explain not just what you're doing, but why it matters. Share the success stories. Show them how these changes benefit everyone, not just a select few." Carla nodded. "We've been considering creating a series of internal videos featuring employees who've embraced the changes and seen positive outcomes. Do you think that would help?" "It's a start," Anthony replied. "But don't just focus on the success stories. Acknowledge the challenges too. Be honest about what's working and what still needs improvement. Authenticity builds trust." The airline took Anthony's advice to heart, launching an internal campaign called Voices of Change. The campaign featured interviews with employees from all levels of the organization, sharing their experiences with the inclusivity initiative. Some spoke about the challenges they had faced in adapting to the new policies, while others highlighted the positive impact it had on their interactions with colleagues and passengers. One particularly moving story came from a ground crew member named Derek, who described how the new reporting platform had empowered him to speak up about an incident of harassment he had witnessed. "Before, I would have kept my head down and stayed quiet," Derek said in his video. "But now, I know my voice matters. And that's a powerful feeling." The campaign resonated deeply within the organization, gradually shifting the narrative around the inclusivity initiative. Employees who had initially resisted the changes began to see their value, and the culture of the airline started to transform in ways that went beyond surface-level gestures. Meanwhile, Anthony's involvement continued to expand. He began receiving invitations from other companies and organizations, eager to learn from the airline's example and apply similar principles to their own operations. At first, he was hesitant. His schedule was already packed, and he didn't want to dilute his focus. But as he considered the broader impact he could have, he decided to accept a few key invitations. One such invitation came from a multinational hotel chain that was grappling with its own inclusivity challenges. Anthony traveled to their headquarters, where he conducted a series of workshops with their leadership team. Drawing on his experiences with the airline, he helped them identify gaps in their policies and develop a roadmap for change. The work was demanding, but it was also deeply fulfilling. For Anthony, it wasn't just about fixing individual organizations, it was about fostering a cultural shift across industries. He began to envision a future where inclusivity wasn't just an afterthought but a core value embedded in every company's DNA. Back at the airline, the progress continued. Maria's viral video had inspired a wave of similar stories, with employees sharing moments where they had stood up for themselves or others. The airline began featuring these stories in their marketing campaigns, positioning themselves as a company that prioritized dignity and respect. But Anthony knew they couldn't rest on their laurels. Progress was fragile, and it only took one misstep to unravel the goodwill they had built. He urged Carla and her team to remain vigilant, reminding them that the journey toward inclusivity was ongoing. One afternoon, Carla called Anthony with an update. "We've been nominated for an industry award," she said, her excitement evident. "It's for our inclusivity initiative. The ceremony is next month, and we'd love for you to attend." Anthony agreed, though he cautioned Carla not to let the recognition distract them from their goals. "Awards are nice," he said, "but they're not the destination. They're just a reminder that we're on the right path." The ceremony was a grand affair, held in a glittering ballroom filled with leaders from across the aviation industry. When the airline was announced as the winner of the Inclusivity Award, Carla and her team took the stage to accept the honor. As they delivered their acceptance speech, Anthony watched from the audience, a quiet sense of pride washing over him. When Carla mentioned Anthony's name, acknowledging his role in their journey, the room erupted in applause. Anthony nodded graciously but stayed seated, content to let the spotlight remain on the team. This wasn't about him, it was about the collective effort of everyone who had worked tirelessly to make a difference. As the evening drew to a close, Anthony reflected on how far they had come. The journey had been challenging, filled with moments of doubt and resistance, but it had also been profoundly rewarding. The knot in his stomach that had once symbolized years of frustration and uncertainty was gone, replaced by a sense of purpose and fulfillment. Anthony knew the work was far from over. There were still battles to fight, barriers to break, and minds to change. But for the first time in a long time, he felt truly optimistic about the future. Together, they were proving that change was possible, and that it could start with something as simple as a single flight. The momentum from the award ceremony invigorated everyone involved in the airline's inclusivity initiative. Employees felt a renewed sense of pride, and management saw the recognition as validation of their efforts. But Anthony King, ever pragmatic, knew this was merely a chapter in a longer story. For true transformation to take root, the company would need to demonstrate sustained commitment, especially when the spotlight eventually faded. As the months unfolded, Anthony continued his advisory role with the airline, but his involvement began to shift. His focus expanded beyond internal policies and cultural shifts to the broader ecosystem that influenced the travel industry. He wanted to tackle systemic issues that extended beyond the confines of a single organization, issues like the economic barriers that prevented many from traveling and the inequities in how different passenger demographics were treated worldwide. One day, during a quarterly meeting with Carla and the leadership team, Anthony presented a bold proposal. "We've done incredible work internally," he said, his tone measured but resolute. "But I think it's time we extend this initiative outward. The airline industry as a whole has a long way to go, and we're in a position to lead by example." The room grew quiet as Carla leaned forward, her interest piqued. "What are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting that we partner with other airlines, industry groups, and even government agencies to establish a universal framework for inclusivity and equity in air travel," Anthony explained. "Imagine an industry-wide commitment to these values, a set of standards that every airline can adopt, not just as a matter of policy, but as a promise to their passengers and employees." Carla exchanged glances with Alan, who had been promoted to Chief Operating Officer following the success of the initiative. That's ambitious, Alan said, though there was no skepticism in his voice. But I agree, it's the logical next step. Over the next few weeks, Anthony and the airline's leadership team began laying the groundwork for what they dubbed the Global Air Equity Alliance. The alliance would serve as a coalition of airlines and stakeholders committed to creating a more inclusive and equitable industry. Its goals were wide-ranging, from standardizing anti-discrimination training for flight crews to developing protocols for addressing bias incidents, both on the ground and in the air. Anthony's network of high-profile connections proved invaluable during this phase. He reached out to executives at competing airlines, leveraging his reputation and influence to bring them on board. He also engaged advocacy groups, travel organizations, and even frequent flyers, inviting them to share their insights and experiences. The response was overwhelmingly positive. While there were some initial doubts, particularly from smaller airlines concerned about the cost of implementing new standards, the majority of stakeholders recognized the potential for meaningful change. As one airline executive put it during an early meeting, if we can make air travel safer and more welcoming for everyone, it's not just good ethics, it's good business. The first formal gathering of the Global Air Equity Alliance took place in London, bringing together representatives from over 50 airlines and organizations. Anthony was invited to deliver the keynote address, a responsibility he didn't take lightly. As he stood at the podium, facing an audience of industry leaders, his mind flashed back to the incident on Flight 528, the moment that had sparked this entire journey. When I boarded that plane, Anthony began, his voice steady, I didn't expect to find myself here today. I didn't expect to become the face of a movement. But what I've learned is that change often starts with the unexpected. It starts with discomfort, with confrontation, and, most importantly, with courage. He paused, letting his words sink in before continuing. This alliance isn't just about policies or procedures. It's about people, our passengers, our employees, and everyone who interacts with this industry. It's about recognizing that air travel is more than a business, it's a bridge between cultures, communities, and dreams. And if we can make that bridge stronger, more inclusive, and more equitable, we'll not only transform this industry, we'll transform lives. The room erupted in applause, but Anthony was already thinking about the work ahead. The alliance had the potential to be a game changer, but only if its members remained committed to its principles. To ensure accountability, he proposed the creation of an independent oversight committee, composed of representatives from diverse backgrounds, to monitor progress and enforce standards. The proposal was met with some resistance, particularly from airlines worried about ceding control to an external body, but Anthony argued passionately for its necessity. Without accountability, he said during one heated discussion, all of this becomes lip service. We owe it to ourselves and to the people we serve to follow through. Eventually, the oversight committee was approved, and Anthony was asked to serve as its inaugural chair. He accepted, though he made it clear that his role would be temporary. This needs to be bigger than any one person, he told Carla during a private conversation. If this alliance depends on me to succeed, we've already failed. As the alliance gained traction, the airline that had started it all began reaping the rewards of its leadership. Customer satisfaction ratings soared, employee retention improved, and the company earned widespread praise for its innovative approach to inclusivity. Anthony was proud of their progress, but he remained vigilant, constantly reminding Carla and her team to stay grounded. Success can make you complacent, he warned during a casual lunch with Carla. Don't let the accolades distract you from the work that still needs to be done. Carla nodded, her determination unwavering. We won't, she promised. You've taught us better than that. But even as the alliance flourished and the airline continued to thrive, Anthony found himself grappling with a new question: what came next for him? He had spent years building his empire, but this journey had reminded him of the deeper purpose that had driven him from the start. He began to consider how he could channel his resources and influence into other areas where systemic change was needed. One evening, as he sat in his study reflecting on the past year, Rachel called. You're not going to believe this, she said, her excitement palpable. The United Nations just reached out. They want you to speak at their Global Equality Summit next month. Anthony felt a flicker of surprise, but quickly composed himself. The UN, he repeated, leaning back in his chair. That's unexpected. They've been following your work with the airline and the alliance, Rachel explained. They think your approach could serve as a model for other industries. Anthony smiled, a sense of clarity washing over him. The opportunity felt like a natural progression, a chance to take the lessons he had learned and apply them on an even larger scale. Tell them I'll be there, he said. In the weeks leading up to the summit, Anthony poured himself into preparation. He crafted his speech with care, drawing on his experiences and the stories of those who had inspired him along the way. He also made a point to reach out to Maria, Derek, Carla, and others who had been instrumental in the journey, thanking them for their contributions and asking for their input. When the day of the summit arrived, Anthony found himself standing before an audience that included world leaders, activists, and visionaries from every corner of the globe. As he began to speak, he felt a profound sense of gratitude, not just for the platform he had been given but for the journey that had brought him there. This isn't just about air travel, he said, his voice resonating through the grand hall. It's about the choices we make every day to build a world where everyone feels they belong. It's about understanding that inclusivity isn't a destination, it's a journey. And it's a journey we must all take together. As he concluded his speech, the audience rose to their feet, their applause echoing like a wave of affirmation. For Anthony, the moment wasn't just a culmination, it was a beginning. The work of creating a more equitable world was far from over, but he was ready to face whatever came next. And this time, he knew he wasn't walking the path alone.